Good evening and welcome to our event, Depression, Anxiety and Jesus. My name's Nate Dawson and I've set up this event for tonight in partnership with Passion for Evangelism and Community in a Crisis. PFE is a network of female speakers and Community in a Crisis is an initiative that I've set up in lockdown to help churches and organisations get online. You're really welcome to be with us tonight. We've got a fantastic panel and great co-host Helen. So Helen, just tell us a bit about yourself and what have you been up to in lockdown?
Thanks, Nay. So I work for a Christian charity called Crosslinks. I look after our church partnerships with our mission partners around the world. I started working from home as soon as lockdown began, which was quite hard. And I've been in London for I think the longest time that I've ever been in London on stretch, which has been very surreal. But I think it's brought about good things and bad things. I think it's a real mixed bag, and I'm sure in time when I look back on it, I'll be able to see a lot more blessings. How about you, Nay? What do you do, and how has lockdown been for you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. So I'm at home with my husband and two girls, and I work for a charity called International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. So I work from home anyway, but travel a bit. But life has been completely upside down with two kids at home and my lovely husband. So we're just about getting through, but can't wait for the summer holidays and life to quieten down a bit. But yeah, welcome to everyone tonight. Please send us your questions, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. All of them will come into our panel here. And I'd like to introduce our panel to you one at a time. So actually, Helen's going to introduce our first guest.
Great. So I'd like to introduce Kate Middleton. So Kate is a psychologist with a particular interest in emotional health in the face of adverse circumstances. She's director of Mind and Soul Foundation, assistant pastor at Zeo Church, Hertfordshire, and she's written many books as well. She lives in Hitchin with her husband and two children. So Kate, how has lockdown been for you?
Yeah, well, hi. First of all, it's really good to be here. So thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'm a bit like Nay. We have two kids here. So we've been doing homeschooling and homeworking and home everything, really. So there's four of us in the household, and we've pretty much not left it for a while, a long time. But I've also gained an unusual affinity with online communication, like most people in this season. And so that strange balance of not leaving the house at all, but also getting to be beamed to all kinds of different people, spaces, places. It's been a wonderful privilege to connect with so many people in a weird season.
We're very excited to have you with us tonight, Kate. I've followed you from afar, so it's really nice to be on a panel with you and get to ask you my own question as well as the audience's questions. So tonight is Philippa Wilson. She's an old friend of mine. Philippa blogs at A Certain Brightness. We're going to be promoting that a lot tonight. Please have a look and look at her fantastic writing. She has taught English to Cardiff teenagers, although obviously not so much in lockdown, and working on her debut novel, which of course we'll all buy once it's out. So Philippa, just tell us a bit, what's it been like for you in lockdown?
Well, again, it's been a mixed bag, but because I'm going to be talking to you about depression for a while, I thought I'd give you some of the highlights. So one highlight has been last year I moved home, so I live with my parents and my brother, and the three of them are like Michelin star chefs. So I've just eaten like an absolute king during lockdown. And if it had been me by myself, I'd have just eaten like Kit Kat Chunkies for 3 months. So that's been a highlight. And the other highlight, which is probably going to feed into like the stereotype that all Welsh people live in the same village together, is that I keep bumping into Sam Warburton. If you don't know who Sam Warburton is, he's a captain of the Wales rugby team, or he was. And so that's been like a massive highlight of lockdown for me. Third massive highlight is I've just taught my family into getting Disney Plus so that we can watch Hamilton.
Absolutely. The only reason to get Disney Plus, surely.
I mean, it's the top reason for sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. Helen, over to you.
Great. And finally, our last panelist is Mark. So Mark is director for Langham Preaching. He's an ordained Anglican minister. He's married to Rachel and they've got 2 years-to-age children. He has written a couple of books called Wilderness and Mirrors and When Darkness Is My Closest Friend, Reflections on Life and Ministry with Depression. Mark, how would you say lockdown has been for you?
Good evening. Well, like everybody before me, a mixed bag. There are things that have been great. So we've had both our kids under one roof for the longest time since, I don't know, about 15 years ago probably. So that's been extraordinary. And I think we've had, on the whole, good family times. We've not killed each other yet. So that's positive. And then I think the negative side is that actually a lot of the stress and anxieties tend to be sort of exaggerated. And I personally am someone who finds the news and current affairs actually feed into my own issues. So I think when so many things in the world are sort of up in the air and uncertain, as well as all the sort of anxieties related to the virus and the season we're in, I think it's inevitable that some of that's going to have a knock-on effect. So I've certainly felt that. But yeah, it's mixed. Good and not so good stuff.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being on our panel. We're really excited for the three of you. The way that the evening's going to work is each panelist is going to speak for 10 minutes. Kate's going to go first, then Philippa. We'll take some questions for 10 minutes after those two, and then we'll hear Mark to finish off, and we'll end with lots of Q&A. So we'd really love you to send in your questions as soon as possible so that we've got questions to ask. But over to Kate for your first talk on anxiety and stress. Thanks, Kate.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, it's a privilege to get to kick off. And to kick off with, I think, a key emotion for this season, and probably two of the things that we've liked least about it, and two of the things that probably as human beings we struggle with the most, but also in a strange way are one of the most essential functions of the human mind. And anxiety is probably the hardest of our more challenging emotions to ignore. And it's designed that way because the job of anxiety is to get your attention when there's something going on in the world around you that might be risky, it might be important, you might need to focus on it. Life is busy, there are so many demands for our attention. Sometimes your brain needs to grab yours to make sure that you avoid a bad outcome, and that's the job of anxiety. It acts a bit like your brain's smoke alarm. So it alerts you to the risk that there might be something you need to act or react to. And anxiety also sets you up ready for that action or reaction, whatever you might need to do to respond, using that physiological system that you might have heard of called the fight or flight system. And it's a complex physiological chain reaction coordinating so many different parts of your body and your mind, so that you're ready to respond to life's dramatic moments. And it's really designed to be a short-term response system. You know, you're walking down the street to get your Saturday paper or something, and a bear jumps out from behind a car, which is probably unlikely in the UK. But hey, whatever it is, in those acute crisis moments, that system is really good at coordinating everything that you need. Whether you're going to fight up the bear or run for your life, you're ready. But that system isn't only for life's distressing acute stress moments. It is your stress response. And physiologically, stress isn't just distress. It's not just the challenging moments. Stress is anything that requires your brain or your body to adapt, to react, to change, to adjust. So they could be physical demands of a moment, or they could be cognitive brain demands like needing to pay attention or problem solve, or just juggle lots of things at once. In our 21st century, 24/7 busy world, so much of our stress is just about the volume of stuff that we're juggling. And in this season, these two issues, anxiety and stress, have been really significant for lots of different reasons. For one, everybody's stress level has been raised, whether you found lockdown distressing or not, whether you've been aware of it being stressful or not. Maybe actually your problem has been you're bored stiff, you've been furloughed, you've been stuck at home, you've had nothing to do, you've been isolated. Those things are strangely stressful, because when your daily routine and rhythm is shot to pieces like that, your brain has to work much harder. So if you think of the challenges of life and your normal week as a bit like climbing a wall, when all your usual handholds are there, all the normal things you expect to have in place as part of your routine, it's easy. You do it without thinking. It's automatic pilot. But lockdown's been a bit like climbing a wall with all those handholds gone. And there's some additional boulders and things you've got to figure out how to get around. Everything's moved around. And that requires a lot more work on your mind, a lot more demand on your brain, whether it's literal problem solving, juggling, capacity issues. Some of us, you've already heard us talking about the challenges of homeschooling, home working, or adapting to constant change and uncertainty. Some of us are very aware of just a raised demand. For others, it has been the challenges of isolation, loss of productivity, or the loss of things that are in our basic human DNA to need, like human connection, physical connection, hugs, that literal physical connection with other human beings. And when your stress baseline rises, you can think of it as a bit like the water level in a pool. So you can't see my feet, but they're down here, trust me. And if I was stood in a pool right now and the water level was down by my ankles, little waves in that pool, which are like the everyday waves of just the little normal challenges of life, they're no problem when your baseline is low. But in a season like this, where your stress baseline has risen, we all have a crisis point where we start to feel close to overwhelm. And when we're in this space, those little things start to feel like actually they might push us under. They might push us into a zone where we can't cope. They might genuinely push you beyond what you can cognitively hold in that moment, your emotional capacity to manage things in that moment, your physical capacity. We get tired as human beings. We have limits. And so because in this moment, we've all been on the edge of overwhelm. Some of us over long periods of time, some of us just with it ebbing and flowing, those moments when lots seems to happen, or you hear something new on the news and it triggers your stress response as your mind's trying to figure out what that means. And the thing is, emotions like anxiety are on the same physiological system. So if your baseline has risen high anyway, then anxiety feels much more ever present. It takes less to push you into an anxiety trigger. It's like when your smoke alarm is just hyper reactive and it goes off every time you put toast on. And when your brain is in that hyper alert state, it changes the way you perceive and act and react to so many things. Like at night when you suddenly hear a sound and you think, gosh, what is that? Is something wrong, or is somebody trying to break in? And suddenly you can hear every sound you would normally never even notice. Your brain is hyper alert. You're on edge. You're twitchy and prickly. And other things change as well. When you're in that overwhelmed zone, your brain goes into this sort of crisis management mode. And so it literally turns down your thinking analytical brain. It's like, this isn't the place to start having deep thoughts or going into some kind of deep analysis. So it's really hard to think clearly, to feel rational. Everything gets reduced to simple binary choices. Are you right or are you wrong? Is this good or bad? Success or disaster? And it's so easy to feel like all of those negative things are true. So you're already feeling overwhelmed, you're already feeling under pressure, you're already feeling anxious, and things just start to feel bleak and negative and difficult in these moments. So feeling an emotion like anxiety isn't optional. It's an essential human emotion. It keeps you safe. You know, I have an 8-year-old son. He could sometimes do with more anxiety, believe me. In this season as well, it's inevitable as we're stepping into spaces where we know we're exposed to risk. We have to make difficult decisions. We will experience anxiety. So it's interesting then that one of the words that's most used in the Bible for fear is actually this Greek word. And the Greek, I always think the Greek language is a bit like they talk about, Eskimos have more than one word for snow. English is really quite limited, I think, in so many ways. And the Greek language is beautiful and poetic. And as people of faith, the Bible is this source of ancient wisdom in moments of life, whatever life is throwing. And this Greek word for fear that's used so often, phobos, it's the same one that we get our word for phobia from. So so we recognize it. But it describes that specific type of fear when you're in overwhelm and you feel like your capacity to cope with the situation has been exceeded. You have no choice but to feel like you've got to get out, you've got to run away. You're in that crisis mode. And there's this amazing story when the disciples were Jesus' mates who he hung out with and taught and who journeyed with him when he was around on the earth. And the disciples are in this boat and Jesus isn't actually with them in the moment, but they're in this time of crisis. It's dark, it's the middle of the night and it's stormy and they are terrified and they're panicking. And Jesus comes to them and he actually walks to them across the water. It's one of the famous miracles in the New Testament. And he says to them, "Do not fear." And so often in the Bible, it says that. And people will repeat that to us in stressful moments or anxiety moments. And the thing is that although people mean that to be helpful, it can feel like it can feel like people are actually speaking down to us. They're saying you've done something wrong by feeling anxious. And that's not always hugely helpful. Remember, anxiety is an essential human emotion. And in that moment when Jesus says to us, "Do not fear," it's important that we understand, therefore, the word that he's saying is not don't experience an emotion like anxiety. What he's saying is in those moments when it's stressful, when life is chaotic, when you feel in the dark or in the middle of a storm, you don't need to feel overwhelmed. You don't need to run. It's a word of reassurance, not of reprimand. And what he's saying to them and what he goes on to say is, you can take courage because I'm here. You're not doing this on your own. There's another source of strength, of encouragement, of something that can help us in those moments when life has gone crazy, when the world around us is in chaos. And what happens actually in that moment is that Peter, he's one of the disciples, actually does something crazy. He steps out of the boat and he walks on water across to Jesus. Because when he's got his eyes fixed on Jesus, he's found this source of something extra. And so many of us need that in moments like this, when we're really aware of having reached our own limits, when we fix our eyes on something solid, something secure, like God, we can find a source of something that gets us through those moments. We can exceed what we should be able to do. We can manage even in the dark, even in crisis. And there's this human moment, though, when Peter, for a moment, while he's doing this amazing thing, his attention is drawn suddenly to the wind and the waves. And it's like that overwhelm level rises again and he feels the panic rise because he's thinking, what am I doing? And he is out of his depth. But again, what Jesus says is what he does actually is he reaches out a hand to him and he reminds him that he's there. And again, that connection with something bigger, something better, something more secure helps us in those moments. It's like Jesus isn't saying you shouldn't feel anxious, you idiot, get a grip. What he's saying is, it's okay. I'm here. You're not on your own. You don't need to run. You can do this. We can do this together. I'm with you. So I guess that's my message tonight in a time when anxiety and stress is inevitable. God doesn't take away our anxiety. It's part of the amazing brain that he's designed. But in moments of chaos, with storms all around and darkness, we can hold our nerve because we know that God is with us. There is a source of something bigger and better we can reach out to. And actually, God reaches out to us in our fear. I'll hand back to you, Helen.
Great. That was so helpful. Thanks, Kate. And I'm sure has given us a lot of food for thought later for some questions. I'm going to introduce Philippa now. So Philippa is going to give us a little talk on her personal story of following Jesus, but also having depression. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you. Okay, so firstly, for some reason, I look like I've spent the whole of lockdown in a tanning bed. I haven't, but like, what can you do about it? While I'm speaking to you, I have two aims and 2 points that I'm hoping to make. So my two aims are to tell you a little bit about my life experience of depression, particularly. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want you to feel able to ask me questions about those things. So please feel free, if you don't feel I've covered them adequately here, to ask about those things. And secondly, to persuade you to consider Jesus. So 2 points. My first point is about depression is that the Bible admits the complexity of pain. So if you are a depressed person, you have probably had the experience of people saying something to you that starts with the words, have you tried? And then they may finish that sentence by saying, have you tried exercise? Have you tried not going on the Kit Kat junkie diet? Have you tried mindfulness? Have you tried? Or they might say it could be worse, or they might say cheer up, or some version of this where your pain as a depressed person has been minimized. What I have found incredible about the Bible is that it doesn't minimize our pain. So there's a verse that I found in Lamentations that doesn't tend to get the Instagram treatment where you get the kind of sunset going on behind it, but it says, your wounds are as deep as the sea, and who can heal you? And God says this when he's speaking to his people, and his people are suffering because they rebelled against him, but they're suffering because of their political situation. They're suffering because of external circumstances. They're suffering for a complicated mixture of reasons. And this is really appealing to me, because when I look at my life, someone could say to me, why are you depressed? And there are all kinds of things. I'm depressed because of my biology, because the chemicals in my brain don't work in the way that I'd used to. Or I could say, well, I'm depressed because I was away from at school from when I was 5. My parents were missionaries. And I think being away from home when you're that young means that your brain goes and works in ways that aren't particularly helpful. I could say, I've had the experience of our family were in Rwanda at the time of the genocide. I could talk about the way my own bad behavior has contributed to my sadness. I could talk about just the world. I mean, sometimes when I look at the world, I'm like, look at it. It's just so broken. And I think what I love about the Bible is that the Bible says, your wounds are as deep as the sea, and who can heal you? And gloriously, it does give an answer to that question. But I think if you are depressed or you have suffered great pain, you will know that compassion begins here. And God shows his compassion by seeing our wounds as they are, seeing our woundedness. And I've just found that comparison so helpful. So, number 1, the Bible admits complexity. And point 2 is the Bible offers comfort. And the Bible offers comfort in the person of Jesus. And this is not another version of me saying, have you tried ... Jesus is the most complex thing there is, aka a person. And so when we look at the life of Jesus, this is where we begin to see where the Bible offers comfort to us in our pain. Now, because I'm really sneaky, I've put 3 subpoints into my second point. So ways that the Bible has offered comfort. So firstly, when Jesus' coming is announced, when his birth is announced, one of the verses that talk about it says, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. And then his uncle prophesies over his life and speaks about what his life is going to be like. And he describes it as being like a sunrise, like the sun rising after a dark night. And then when Jesus begins his ministry, he begins by using a piece of the Bible to describe what his ministry is going to be like. And it includes these words from the Old Testament that say, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bind up the brokenhearted. And then you see that in Jesus' ministry. You see it in the way that he approaches sick people. And you see it in the way that he speaks truth. And you see it in the way that he is so pro people's emotional restoration. And then the pinnacle of Christian faith is the cross. And I think the cross, one of the things that's so powerful about it, and I find it radical in terms of the Christian faith, is at the center of the Christian faith, there is a God who is suffering. There is a God who knows what it feels like to feel forsaken. There is a God who knows what it feels like to be torn apart, not just physically, but emotionally too. And so one way that's been a big comfort to me in my dealing with depression is realizing that the God of the universe is not a God who is unfamiliar with suffering. In fact, the Bible explicitly says he is familiar with grief. He is a man of sorrows. And then another enormous way that the cross has helped me is that it is through the cross that Christians believe that our sins are forgiven. Now, Lots of people experience depression differently, but for me, guilt was a huge factor in how my depression manifests itself. At some stage, it has manifested itself enormously with guilt. And like everything, guilt is complex. So some of the guilt that I felt was not real guilt. It was just ways of me processing a reality I didn't really understand. But some of it I knew was real. Some of the guilt that I had because I'd messed up. I had because I'd done things wrong. And yet, when I first had the cross explained to me, I understood at the cross, Jesus was punished for the things that I had done wrong. In every way that I had crossed the line into being guilty, Jesus had dealt with it. And to have that, I understood that first when I was 15. And it has been so powerful to me to know that the burden of my sin has been carried by Jesus. And it's been like the forgiveness of sins is a glorious big deal. And it's also glorious because Jesus carried the burden of my sin to the cross. And so that's really helped me feel like I can trust him with my other burdens. And then the other thing, when I'm looking to the past, is that the centerpiece of Christianity is an empty tomb. Now, I cannot think of anything more hopeless than a tomb. You know, death is the reason why all our hopelessness is justified. And yet Christianity claims that in history, Jesus was not just put in a tomb as a dead body, but that he came out of the tomb, risen, full of resurrection life and power and the capacity to redeem. And there have been so many times when in my life I have felt in a situation that feels like a tomb, that I find it very difficult for me to work up hope from within myself. But when I look to the tomb, I know that it's a glorious pattern for history, that just because things look hopeless, just because things look dark, just because things look an awful lot like death, doesn't mean that it's the end. And of course, if what's happened in history is true, then that's going to impact the present as well. And there's a beautiful verse that says, where Jesus says, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." And my experience has been that Jesus has been with me in the pit. And sometimes it doesn't always feel like it. But I've got the promise of God's word that even if my mind forsakes me, Jesus will not forsake me. Jesus lives, and if he lives, then he lives to make a difference. I can see that I'm running out of time. So third sub-point is the future. And there's more to be said on the Rwanda experience. But one thing that was really significant about the Rwanda experience was, after all of that suffering, after all of that brokenness, the only hope for restoration would be that justice would come. And Christians believe that justice is coming, that things will be put right in the future by Jesus, that all things will be made new, that Jesus coming out of that tomb is the beginning of things being redeemed, of things being made new. So I guess the encouragement that I want to give to you, there's more than I could say. Of course there is, because there's been 20 years of depression where I have felt in the pit, and I do not want the things that I'm saying to make you think that I don't struggle with depression. Anyone who has known me any amount of time knows that this battle is real. But I know that Jesus is committed to binding up my broken heart. And I would just implore you to consider Jesus. This is someone who is described as being like a sunrise, and described as being someone who binds up broken hearts, and described as being someone who's like a gardener. And so it's worth at least considering him, and considering, is it true? And it may be that as you're listening to me speak, you think, well, that's great. For you, I'm glad that that's kind of brought you comfort, makes you feel better. You know, it's obviously, you know, a bit of a psychological crutch for you, but that's a great thing for you. And I guess the kind of pushback that I'd want to give to that would be part pushback and part not so much pushback, because you're absolutely right. Like, it might make me feel better to believe that Keanu Reeves in Hollywood wants to marry me, right? But if it's not true, then that's not exactly a good thing for, you know, a good way for me to approach my mental health. But if it is true, if it could be true that Jesus really did rise from the dead, it's at least worth considering it. And the fact that it's worked for me, you know, the fact that it does bring me some degree of comfort in spite of depression and being away at school and the horrors of Rwanda, the fact that there has been some measure of comfort, I think the fact that it works is a reason to give it a go rather than a reason to dismiss it. So I'd really encourage you to consider Jesus, and I really look forward to answering some of the questions that I have no doubt that this has opened up. Thank you.
Brilliant. Philippa, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. I've got my husband and daughter listening in the background too. What's really great about tonight is that our guests are just really honest and open. So we'd love you to be honest and open back and send in your questions. I'm going to invite Mark and Kate and Helen back into the room. We're going to have 10 minutes of Q&A. You've not yet heard from Mark. You will do after this. But Mark, we're very excited about hearing from you. Kate, thanks again for an excellent talk. I was just sitting there thinking, you're just making so much sense of how I feel. So thank you. I'm sure our audience is feeling the same. We're going to start with a great question from Anna Naif, if that's how you pronounce your surname. Sorry if it's not. She says, so if anxiety is good because it alerts us to something important, why are we trying to get rid of it through, for example, focusing on Jesus and his power? Kate, can I have a go at that first?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? I think our instinct is so often to try to get rid of anxiety. We want to eradicate it completely. But the reality is the secret to fearing less isn't about getting rid of anxiety, because it does serve this good function. What we need to do is to avoid that overwhelm and the panic that is so awful and places us in this space that is so uncomfortable. And our 21st century life does often place us under pressure. So it does require us to hold things like anxiety over longer periods of time. And doing that without panicking, it's the fear of fear that is often the bigger problem than the original anxiety itself. And that, I think, is very often the key to what we're trying to do, particularly in an elongated season like this. You know, I can't change this season. I can't beam my family out of it or the people I'm supporting. What I can do is help them to hold the pressure and the stress, and to find tips and tricks and good rhythms and practices that help them to avoid overwhelm in a difficult season.
Thanks so much, Kate. Mark, would you like to add to that?
I guess the issue is so often one of extremes, isn't it? So, and it's the sustained anxiety or sort of hypervigilance that is the damaging thing. That's what I've often found myself battling with. So we need the sort of sharp shock moments, as Kate was explaining at the beginning. But it's problems come when there's no let up from it and there's no ostensible cause. So I found for years, I would wake up in the morning with this profound sense of dread that was just amorphous. I couldn't pinpoint it. And that's what alerted me that something was seriously wrong.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thanks. Next question is from Naomi Rolfe. Hi, Naomi. I hope you're doing well and surviving lockdown okay. So probably for Kate, I think, what would be your top tips to stop feeling anxious if you're feeling really overwhelmed and you think, I'm going to have a panic attack? How do you stop that?
Well, it's worth just quickly talking about what happens in a panic attack. So remember, anxiety is a really physical emotion designed to grab your attention. So it's hard to ignore. Those physical sensations are difficult to ignore, and they grab you and occupy your focus. That's the natural thing when you're in an anxious moment. And they're preparing you for action, but those are dramatic physical changes. And sometimes we're so focused on other things that physiological change starts, and we don't realize what it is, or we're not sure what's causing it. Or like Mark says, if you're in a place where anxiety has become difficult, or you're close to overwhelm, your stress baseline has risen and you're always feeling on the edge of that, those symptoms can feel like they're always slightly present. And in those moments, our fear of those symptoms can cause them to grow, because fear becomes a vicious cycle, either just because we hate feeling that way, or because we're afraid it means something else. So people say, I thought I was going to have a heart attack, or I thought I was going to faint or pass out or throw up or something like that. And so it builds up and builds up and builds up, and a panic attack can be really dramatic and distressing, and they're horrible to witness, horrible to experience. And many people then get caught in a cycle of anxiety because they're afraid to trigger another attack like that. So again, it's this place where you're caught in the fear of fear. And I think the key is, first of all, just understanding helps a lot, because it does take some of the fear out. And then learning, how do we drop our physiological response in that moment? And there are tips and tricks you can learn using things like your breathing, which help to reset your physiological stress or anxiety meter and drop that level down in the moment. And you can learn approaches and things that you can do in the moment, but also approaches to help you to keep that baseline lower. Remember, if your stress baseline is lower, you're further away from overwhelm, you're less likely to get pushed into panic attack. Sometimes our stress level creeps up and we don't realize it. And a lot of people, the first time they have a panic attack is the first time that they realized just how overwhelmed they were with what life was throwing at them in that moment. So I think understanding and then learning some really good practical tips and tricks to help you manage the physiology of what's going on in that moment. And then, of course, there's long-term work to help you deal with some of the background causes, whatever it is for you, whether that's the stuff life is throwing at you in that moment, or other things about how you're acting and reacting to the demands of your world.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate. So we've got a really good question here that responds to what Philippa was saying. Philippa, I know like your family background and where you've been in your life. You mentioned being in Rwanda. Well, you didn't mention being there, but you mentioned what happened. I don't know whether you can expand on that a bit, but particularly as we're thinking about John Levins's question, he says, the fact that we're fully forgiven at the cross for our genuine guilt is really helpful to me personally, but I've always struggled with how to talk to depressed people about it. So could you have a go answering that, but also just add a bit more about what you meant about Rwanda, why that fits into what you're saying?
Okay, so I think I'll start with John's question, and then I'll talk a little bit about Rwanda. I think the glorious thing about the cross is, well, there are many, but one of them is that I just find it really liberating that I didn't have to figure it out anymore. You know, like there's false guilt, there's true guilt, and I can go to the cross, and like the cross says that we are not guilty. Like that is the declaration. The declaration that has been made if we are trusting in Jesus is not guilty. There was a price that needed to be paid, and it has been paid in full, not guilty. And so it just means that as a depressed person, when these feelings of guilt come, I'm like, well, the cross is where you go. I don't care where you've come from, what you've done. Like, I don't know it's complex. And so we take the guilt to the cross, wherever the guilt has come from. And, you know, I don't want to be dismissive, because I think some of those patterns that we have of thinking may be things that we have internalized from, you know, our childhood, for example. And, you know, I'm really pro, you know, if you're able to, therapy, being able to kind of work, you know, figure out why you think in the way that you do. But I think we can preach the cross to false guilt, and we can preach the cross to real guilt. You know, they both can go to the cross, and they can both, you know, and often they both run, you know, they both listen to the truth, you know, can listen to the truth of it. So I don't want to kind of oversimplify, but I also, for me personally, it was just really liberating to be like, okay, I don't have to figure it out anymore. You know, because I was always trying to be like, well, what's on me? There's going to be something on me. And now I'm like, of course there's something on me. Of course it's partially my fault. Of course there's some degree of fault within me. Let's go take it to Jesus. And while we're talking about the cross, I'll talk about Rwanda in the cross in the context of Rwanda. So for lots of people in Rwanda, it was a brutal, brutal genocide. Like 1 million people died in 100 days. So many people were involved in the killings. And there was no way that justice could, like, any even semblance of justice could happen within that community. And I've recently been reading a book that a woman wrote about restoration within Rwanda. And for them, there were two things that brought them comfort. One thing was the future, the certainty that in the future, Jesus would come again and bring justice. And I think we can be quite dismissive in the West of the idea of God being just. But if you have suffered like that and there is no earthly way you are going to find justice, then knowing that true justice will happen when Jesus comes again is enormously comforting. But what was even more radical than that was that they realized that forgiveness had to happen. And the way that forgiveness could happen would be either this person's sin has been punished and Jesus took the punishment for these crimes of genocide on the cross, in which case we don't demand any more payment from these people, or when Jesus comes in glory, he's going to bring true justice. And that set them free. That set them free to be able to pursue restoration. That set them free so they now have set up these systems where, like, a Tutsi woman has a cow and the cow has a calf and they give the calf to a Hutu woman and then that has a calf. And these are people whose, husbands were killed by one another. So you see the power of the cross in that. That's a long answer.
Thank you, Philippa, so much. And you were in Rwanda, weren't you, with your family? You grew up there and then moved back to the UK.
Yeah.
When you were 10.
Yeah, and I agree with what Mark was saying. I find for me, like, the world really triggers depression. Like, it's just terrible. I mean, sorry, I'm just saying that in like a really depressing. But I think that the part of like the overwhelming nature of what reality is like, we need a complex solution, we need something complex. We need someone complex. Simplicity won't do.
Thanks, Philippa, so much. So we're going to hear from Mark now, and then after Mark, we'll have much longer Q&A. So Mark's going to talk about escaping loneliness and isolation. So Mark, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thanks very much for having me. Well, I don't know what people's experience has been, but I think one of the sort of key features of this season has been obviously isolation, that we've been stuck in our homes and cut off from friends, from family, and with isolation very often comes loneliness. And loneliness is different from just being alone and solitude, which can be helpful and beneficial and important. And sometimes, we need to seek those things. But this is different. This is imposed on us by circumstances beyond our control, and we're cut off. But I think one of the reasons that this season has exacerbated people's mental health and well-being problems is that mental illness actually brings its own loneliness and isolation. And so what's happening is just compounding, it's just piling on top of that. I think there are a number of ways in which this works. So one of the things with depression particularly, and other sort of forms of that, is that you start believing things that go around your mind that aren't necessarily accurate or realistic about the way things are, but they have a slightly distorted sort of perspective. And you start believing that and start assuming that when you see people act in certain ways, you know exactly why they're doing what they're doing, and read into it probably the most negative and sort of hostile interpretations you can. And that compounds the sense of isolation, because you think, well, these people are doing this because they're out to get me, or they don't like me, or they've had enough of me, or they're embarrassed by me, all these different things. And so within ourselves, we naturally want to retreat. We want to sort of pull back from that because of the exposure and the shame of that. So we've got this dynamic inside that actually forces us to do probably the one thing, or one of the things that actually is least beneficial for us, which is to withdraw. And yet at the same time, and I know that many people find this, is that those around us who don't really get these kinds of sensations, these perceptions, these distortions, they find it very difficult to relate to and understand what you're on about. And that's nobody's fault. I mean, how can you relate to something that is so beyond your own personal experience? It's very difficult to imagine. It's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of somebody dealing with this, especially because, well, we've talked a bit about the physical symptoms, but they tend to be internal. Someone with depression actually may look fine, may even look quite smiley and chirpy and happy, and completely mask the turmoil and pain that's going on inside. And so when you try to talk about some of this stuff, I don't know if you found this, but people find it a little bit awkward, or they're just not quite sure what to do. And so perhaps even a little embarrassed about it. And you just have those sort of awkward silences, and you sort of kind of agree to not continue. They find it embarrassing, you find it embarrassing. And so it's just easier not to try and persevere with it. And they very often and naturally will not come that close again, or they won't put themselves in a position where they find themselves having to engage with this kind of thing. I mean, we all do that, don't we, with things that are beyond our experience or alien to us. We naturally recoil from things that are other, that are foreign. And it takes a step of courage, really, to say, no, I don't like this, or I don't understand it, but I am going to try and find out. So very often you find this double whammy, that mental illness causes you on the inside to withdraw, and those around you, unless they really are intentional about it, causes those around us to just keep their distance for all our sakes, as it were. And this is a disaster for all kinds of reasons. But when this is happening in a situation of isolation anyway, and we all know what it's been like with this sort of physical distancing and social distancing, so-called. We've tried to keep in touch with people, but I find when I'm at my weakest or lowest, the thought of engaging somebody else yet again is just sometimes too much. And then with all the sort of Zoom and Skype sort of aspects added in, I mean, I think we've all been zoomed out over the last few months. I mean, it's been an amazing thing to have and to be able to use, but there's definitely too much of a good thing. And the thought of going on to another Zoom conference call or whatever it is just sometimes overwhelmingly negative. And so we find ourselves in a very sort of dark and difficult place. I think one of the things I would say is that actually we need to begin by looking for friendships, looking for connections in places that we might not necessarily anticipate finding them. And that means, I think, in all kinds of other media and means by which we can connect with people. And I would say personally, from my own experience, I found reading a book written by somebody who's not a Christian, but who died about 15 years ago or so, I can't remember exactly the dates. I found reading this particular book, the author is William Styron, and it's a little book called Darkness Visible. This was one of the first books I'd read by anybody that articulated something that I could immediately relate to. It took somebody who was a novelist, and a brilliant novelist at that, to be able to articulate the things that can't be articulated. I mean, that's basically what we're dealing with. And I find so much of the language we use for mental illness utterly inadequate and feeble and useless. And it took someone like William Styron to begin to find some of the language. And it was as if I'd found a friend. I'd found somebody who actually was giving me the vocabulary. And so suddenly, by reading this old book, I didn't feel as isolated as I had. Now, ultimately, I would say we find that in extraordinary ways in the Bible. I find particularly the Psalms are full of that. And you find, when you start looking for them, the Psalms, which is basically the old Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, their songbook, if you like, is full of people describing, well, things that actually were uncannily similar to some of those moments. And it was like, whoa, there's this ancient friend I've got from 2.5 millennia ago, if not longer. I was finding friends there. And then ultimately, of course, that's what Christians say is true of Jesus. I mean, it sounds like a cliche and a bit naff, doesn't it? You know, to find a friend in Jesus. But I think there's something supremely true and important in particularly this context, because he understands every aspect of what it means to be human. He was and is human. But there's one verse, I think I'll just sort of pick one verse really, that has been a real bedrock for me, because it talks about Jesus's humanity. And there's just half a verse. It's in the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 2. And he's talking about all human beings. And it says, Jesus is not ashamed to call them, us, brothers and sisters. In other words, he is not afraid of finding out about us. In fact, there's nothing about us that would surprise him. He's not put off by that. He is somebody who knows us better than we know ourselves, including all that darkness that we might be battling inside, and says, I still want you on my team. And for me, that was like a sort of lightning bolt. That was a remarkable, life-changing recognition. Suddenly, there might have been people around who couldn't handle it, but here was one who not only understood, but could seriously handle it and walk me through. And I would testify over the last 20 years or so that that's precisely what he's been doing. There have been many times I've doubted that. There have many times I've struggled to hold on to that. But the bottom line is that has been the bedrock. He knows, and no one else can truly say, I know what it's like. I mean, they can't. But he can, and he says, I still want you on my team. And that has kept me going.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's so helpful to have three panelists with three different perspectives, but also into a situation which is just so pertinent for each one of us listening. We're really grateful for all of the questions that are coming in, so please keep them coming in. I'm going to welcome back now all of our panel and the lovely Helen, and we're going to go for as many of these questions as possible. We've got so many, so Helen and I are just going to choose one at a time and we'll go for them. So Helen, Mark, we've got Mark as well if we lost him. But do you want to choose a question first and go for it, and then hopefully Mark will come back soon?
Yeah,
we've got Mark.
Sure. So this is from Rose Chesney. I guess this could go to either Mark or Kate, in particular about anxiety, and then the same for depression for Philippa, which is, does turning to God alleviate all anxiety? She says, someone told me that God heals everything, but I've turned to him many times and nothing has been alleviated, which I get true for all mental health difficulties. Let's start with you, Kate. How would you comfort or offer hope to Rose in this particular circumstance?
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful. First of all, let's talk about an elephant in the room. We pray to God for healing, and we know that sometimes people do experience healing, but not everybody does. And it's a mystery and it's a tension, and we have to name it and be aware that that's one of the challenges of life on this earth, in a world where there's chaos and difficulty and challenge. And as many people have said, sometimes our emotional reactions to a difficult world are difficult, and holding that tension and being honest and real about the fact that sometimes life is tough, sometimes emotions are tough, depression is brutal or difficult. I think it's important that we're aware of that. In terms of emotions as well, more widely, as I say, they're part of the way your brain was designed. So it wouldn't make sense for God to alleviate a whole emotion like anxiety. In fact, people who don't experience anxiety in a normal way struggle. They're incapacitated with normal life. But what we're looking for is a space to journey from where we are to somewhere that feels better, that feels like we're experiencing more light, less of the difficulty. And so looking at alleviating, like Mark has said, those moments where anxiety feels like it's constant, it's relentless, it's never ending, the difficulty and the distress of emotional illness. And I mean, emotional health isn't something that you either have or don't have. It's like physical health. It's a line. We all go up and down. We have good days. We have bad days. Life throws good times at us and difficult times. And the amazing thing I think about our experience with God is that he journeys with us, and we learn new things about ourselves and about what God thinks of us. Like Philippa has said, our understanding of grace and the way God loves us and cares for us can transform our views of ourselves, that can relieve us from some of the pressure of difficult emotions. But also in the dark and difficult moments, we have a source of light and hope and life that we can look to when otherwise life could feel relentlessly dark and difficult.
Great, that's really helpful. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mark.
Just a small thing that, if somebody told you that coming to Jesus would make your life completely sorted, then they weren't telling you the truth. And that's not what Jesus promises. We come to him because he's true, because he's Lord, and because of all that he does for us. And, Philippa's talking about the cross. That's absolutely right. But I think we've got to understand that actually there are many parts of the Christian life that, frankly, are inconvenient. I mean, he makes our life more complex. I do a lot of work in different parts of Europe and other places, and I've got friends who've come to know the Lord Jesus for themselves from very different backgrounds, say Muslim backgrounds or in the Middle East or others, where actually the very act of them coming to Christ massively complicated their lives. I mean, that's an understatement. And the issue is trying to understand what God's timing is in all of this, what he promises and when he promises it. And I think, Kate just said that he journeys with us. And I think that's crucial, that he sustains us, but he doesn't wipe away all the tears until the very end. And sometimes there are going to be a lot of tears. And I think that's when you really need to know you're not alone in it. He's not going to just give you a sort of sweet pill that just makes you feel better, because actually that probably isn't really going to deal with the problem anyway.
And I think that's part of the problem with coming to terms with the fact that Christianity is true. I think, like I've said, I've had great comfort from Christianity, but there have definitely been times when I have wanted to go off in a strop and been like, God, I'm done. Like,
seriously,
get me out of here. Eject. Where's the eject button? And God has not shown me the eject button. But that's part of it. Like, it's because it's true. Once you have the conviction that it's true, that you can't walk away. And that, yeah. And I guess like part of the kind of intimacy of the relationship that we have with God is being able to say things like that to him. Like, I'm done. And God, generally speaking, has probably laughed when I said that. Not because he's me, but because he knows I'm not done. He knows that, he's the one who's going to keep me going. And he does. And I'm thankful for that. Thank
you so much, Philippa. So we've got quite a few questions on how you help other people. I'm not sure if this is a backwards way of saying, how do I help myself? But generally, there's quite a few coming through, both on Twitter, personally, thanks, Esther, and on Facebook. So Miles Drake, his question here summarises it really. When it comes to administering pastoral care or basically helping people that are struggling with mental health, what does it mean to help them, but also if you're struggling yourself? So how do you help people when you're struggling yourself? That's a question that's come through quite a lot tonight in different ways. And Esther, also to add to that from Twitter, was saying because of lockdown, because we've been away from church, how we do that as well in the context of lockdown. I don't know who wants to go first on that one. Mark, go for it.
We must understand our limits. I think that's one of the first tasks we ever have. It's just knowing what is possible, what is unhelpful, and just what our boundaries are. I think that's an important thing to do anyway in life, regardless of whether one has mental illness issues. I think for me, I know that in my darkest times, I've been fairly clear what I've needed. I think I've not wanted people to come and fix me or to have answers. Sometimes, actually, they're the times when I want to punch people's lights out. I want friends, not people who will fix me. But actually, even than that, I think the thing I crave very often is to be accompanied, which is a bit of a cumbersome word, really, and it contains a lot of different things. But I want just somebody who will just be alongside and not try and root out what the causes might be, or start sort of probing and being a sort of amateur psychologist or whatever it is. I just want someone who will be with me in the truest sense of it. And if you're in a position to do that for somebody else, that's probably one of the greatest gifts you can give them. And I think that's the amazing thing about the Lord Jesus, and you know, the way God has worked all the way through the Bible. One of his names in the Old Testament is Emmanuel, God with us. He's being with us. And I think we reflect something of him when we do that for one another. Sometimes it includes words. I'm absolutely pro words, but I think we just got to be very, very careful and sensitive and just aware of how we use them.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Mark says. I mean, that's brilliant. Like the word in the New Testament for comfort literally is a coming alongside someone, a journeying with them, and the willingness to do that, but also doing that with an awareness of what that means. So many people step into it, and really what they're hoping is to fix someone. They want the magical story, and especially for emotional health, there's very rarely one moment where suddenly everything changes and someone's transformed. It's a journey, and as I say, we all have emotional health. And as leaders, there's a really interesting balance between our authenticity as how we do that in pastoral care, and the appropriate boundaries that Mark talks about. I mean, I came to this as a psychologist from a more clinical background where there's a really clear boundary and you do not share of yourself, although it's becoming more acceptable to do that a bit now. But the wonderful, wonderful thing about church life and pastoral care is I don't come to that as a cold clinical professional. This is my church as well that I work in. The people I minister to, they know my family and my kids. They see them at my best, but they also share some of my more difficult moments. And I'm not called to be a superhero to minister to those people. I'm called to be authentic. But there's a balance because I am called to be a leader. So I do have to hold my nerve and I have to hold things for people. And I need to have good enough boundaries to do that. And as Mark said, know my limits, know the appropriateness, know when I need to step back and have the maturity to look after my own well-being as well, because if I don't care for myself, I can't care for other people. So I think there's a real balance of all of those things, but I love the grayness of it. I mean, I love the fact that the people who I care for now as a church leader, they're much more than just patients to me, and I'm there throughout their life and I see their highs and lows, and we journey through long seasons, decades. There are people I've been able to support and journey through with now for sort of 15, 16, 17 years, and that's a wonderful privilege.
Thank you so much.
Should we go to another question? It's very quick.
Go for it, Phil.
I think like Jesus does call for us to die to ourselves. And part of me doesn't want to put a but after it, but I'm going to. But he wants us to die so that we will live again. Like, he doesn't want us to die so that we die. Like, Jesus isn't interested in like running his servants into the ground. And so I guess I was just referring to kind of the part of that question, which was the idea of us kind of the extent to which we sacrifice ourselves. Like, some of the ways that Jesus will bring us healing is through our ministering. But I don't think that means that we need to, like, that's very different from us thinking that we need to, like, you know, batter ourselves into the ground and in the cause of ministry.
Thanks, Phil. Helen, over to you for a question.
Great. I think this can probably go probably to Kate. I think it's probably something that we're all prone to more in lockdown. So Sam T says once she starts thinking about something that bothers her, she can't stop and she analyzes it for almost constantly for days. I mean, I think that is the case with all of us when we went into lockdown. I certainly found myself having to switch off the news, limit my screen time, make sure that I didn't inundate myself with this weird obsession with a pandemic. So her question is, how can she snap out of it before going down this spiral, which we all know is not very helpful for any of us?
Yeah, definitely. Such a good question. And I think there's two things going on there. There is that the constant obsessive thinking pattern. And when your brain is wired, when you're close to overwhelm, when you're on that crisis mode, your thinking is switched onto this hyper twitchy state where it's very, very difficult to switch off. You're constantly scanning the horizon for the latest new thing, the latest thing you might have to respond to. And the other thing is that negative spiral when your thinking can then lead you to somewhere that's not very helpful. And they're two slightly different questions. I mean, the first one, there's definitely three things I would say, because it's such a huge issue in this sort of season or any season where life is throwing a lot at you. And the first thing is about boundaries, which I know Mark's already mentioned. Just trying to think about, can you limit your exposure to things that are going to trigger those anxious thoughts that are going to get you into one of those spirals? You don't need to have the news on all the time. Remember, the job of the media is to fill airspace, so they will constantly talk and hypothesize and project about things, most of which will never happen. So you're going to waste a lot of time worrying about a lot of things that will never happen. Maybe limit it. Choose one news program that you listen to once a day. Just do it then. Think about the boundaries around that sort of stuff. The second thing is think about your baseline, your stress baseline, because the more your overall stress level is raised, the more twitchy your brain will be and the harder it will be for you to switch it off, the more likely you are to get drawn into those patterns. So think about the rhythm of your week. When do you rest? When do you relax? Again, boundaries. Do you have moments where you get away from it all? So hard in lockdown when everything has been squashed into the same space. A lot of us are like working, doing family life, doing homeschooling, or you're just stuck in your own space with your own thoughts if you've been isolating on your own. So hard. So do you have ways you can get away from that, moments of headspace, of escape, whether that's escape to people or from people? So think about the things that you need to do to drop your overall baseline. And the third thing is just super practical. When you're in that space and your brain is buzzing, get those thoughts out of your head and onto paper. So loads of research that shows this is helpful. It's like when you go to the supermarket and you've got 5 things to remember and you've not written a list. You have to keep reciting them. Otherwise, you come out of there and you cannot remember why you went in. You get home and then you remember it all. So when you're in the supermarket, you find yourself walking around going bread, butter, beans, eggs, bacon, bread, butter, beans, eggs, bacon, or whatever it is. And it's like if your brain allows you to stop doing that, you'll forget stuff. So when you're in that hyper alert state, your brain is like, you have to keep thinking about this, woman or man. Otherwise, you might forget something really important. If you write it down, it lets your brain let it go. It gives you permission to stop thinking about it. Loads of research showing that will release you. Just like if you've written the list, you don't have to think about it. If you can get those thoughts out of your head, either just brainstorm all the things that are worrying you. And I know that sounds like you might obsess more about them, but actually it releases your mind. Or before you go to bed, because often people find this, they're trying to go to sleep. And the one time you want to switch off is the one time your brain is like, finally, I have your attention. Here's all the things you should be worrying about. Not helpful. So before you go to bed, just take half an hour, write those things down, write a plan for tomorrow. What are the things I must remember to do in the morning? What are the things I'm worrying about? And all the research shows that it does help you to switch off some of those really annoying, ticky, round and round thoughts.
Kate, it's just so helpful to have you with us, because when you speak, I'm like, I wish Kate just lived in my house. I'm sure a lot of people...
No, you don't want me living in your house in lockdown. I'm very crabby, believe me.
Well, maybe social bubble sometime. Anyway.
My toilet level is like down here. So.
Mine too, it's all right. I think this next question should go to Philippa. So this is from Emma Brewster. It says, when you're overwhelmed and all you see is darkness and no way out at all, what then? for person concerned, for those close to that person looking in. Philippa, maybe you can give that a go first.
I think I'd like to refer that question to my friends.
Oh, give it a go, Philippa. Give it a go, and then we'll have Mark afterwards.
I guess I'd want to start by just saying, I've been there, and it's horrible, and yeah, that darkness can feel really overwhelming. I think I guess I'd say different things to different people. I think what I have needed to know in those situations is that my friends see me, my friends love me. They aren't defining me by that experience of depression. They're not seeing me as being that person who is just like, you know, skulking off to her room, hiding under the blankets, and that they will show up. Like that's the thing that's made a big difference to me, is having people show up consistently and in a way that, you know, shows that they are invested in me. I think if you are close to a person who is going through that, my top thing to say is pray for them. Pray that the darkness will lift. Pray that there will be a way through. I mean, when I'm going to have to say this with a bit of context, but I got to a stage in my depression where, with people offered to pray for me, I was like, I don't want you to pray for me unless you pray that the depression goes away. Like, I don't want you to pray for me. And partly it was because I was tired of hearing prayers that were like, dear Jesus, please give Philippa the strength of character to persevere. But I was like, I don't want strength of character. No, I want but also because and I guess I'm talking to Christians here, but like, there is something powerful in praying that Jesus will take away depression. And it's not because, and I hope it's clear from everything I've said, it's not because I think that Jesus necessarily will take away depression. But if you pray that he will, there are things that you acknowledge that are powerful. Number one, you acknowledge that you do not know what to do. You acknowledge that you are helpless, that you actually haven't got a quick fix for this. You're acknowledging that my wound is as deep as the sea, and that you're not easily going to be able to fill it with a little bucket full of, have you tried yoga? You're acknowledging the depth of the wound, that we're going to need supernatural intervention here. And it acknowledges that Jesus is stronger than depression. And even if Jesus doesn't heal, and he hasn't, and honestly, I can see that it's going to be a lifelong process of healing and restoration for me. But even if he doesn't, I need to know that he has the power to do it. I need to know that he is good enough and powerful enough to take that away. So I guess that's what I would say in terms of for those who are around them. And for the person concerned, I don't know. I don't really want to give advice to someone who's depressed in some ways, apart from to say, like, you're still loved, you're still precious. Like, I have lived my life in fear of those moments when I'll be at the bottom of the pit. And I guess I have to, now I can say to myself, even if I go there, even if I end up in that depth, Jesus will still be with me. Like, he's not going to abandon me because I slipped down the slope into depression again. And I think that's helpful. But I'm sorry, I don't really feel like that's answered the question. I do have to blog on it, so
read Philippa's blog. We'll share the link later.
Just to get the plug in.
To add anything onto what Philippa's saying.
I would just say to someone in this position, just quite simply, first of all, just don't give up. I know how awful it is to feel in that place, and remember, when your mind is overwhelmed with emotion, it simplifies things. And things feel worse than they are. And it's very, very difficult to problem solve when you're in that place, because your thinking brain is switched off and everything just turns to mush. I call it the swamp zone, because when you're in there, you can't get out yourself. You need someone sometimes to help you. So the other thing I would say is reach out, and it's really important that we do say that. You know, sometimes we become unwell and we need help, and that might be a friend, but it might also be professional clinical help. You know, these are illnesses, and even in times of pandemic and lockdown and difficulty, there are people there who can help you. And sometimes just reaching out to a GP, having a conversation, saying, do you know what, actually I'm struggling. That's a really important step to trying to get out of the space that you're in, but don't give up. Brighter days will come.
Thank you, Kate. Mark, anything to add?
We went through, as a family, we read all the Hunger Games books. My daughter got into it big time, and I got quite addicted to the books, and they're better than the films, as ever. But I think there's one particular bit in the third, if you have seen or read, Peter's been captured by the bad guys, and they completely messed with his brain and his perspective. And Katniss is the one that he trusted most and loved before, but what they've done to his brain has utterly destroyed that trust and completely corroded it. But gradually they work through this, and then they have a kind of shorthand for how they deal with this. And basically, Peter just needs to ask, real or not real? And I think for me, that little sort of cameo, if you like, has been hugely significant, because I think you need this person, hopefully, who is accompanying you. You need them to be on hand, not to fix, not to sort of pile in advice and stuff, but to be there for you to be able to ask real or not real. Because I was saying earlier, remember that one of the things this does is utterly distort your perspective, and it just it reinterprets everything with the darkest possible lens. And so you're actually convinced that the way you see things is the way they are. But you need somebody that you trust to be able to say, not real. And I think it particularly, you know, right in the pit or in the cave or whatever idea you sort of latch onto, to find somebody who you can just say real or not real, and that's or whatever sort of shorthand you have. And so you can just use it as a kind of benchmark. Because our handle on reality is fading, and so ideally the person alongside us has got a better grip on it. And I think for friends, just being available for those moments is one of the most loving things you can do. It's a real act of generosity. It's costly because there's a lot of hanging around. But sometimes just to be able to be in the same room as somebody and you're both reading your books or whatever, and the other person is just getting on with stuff, but they're just there, that is enough. In fact, I don't want to be engaged in conversation perhaps. But at that moment when I'm suddenly having a panic and thinking, whoa, this is all dark and grim, to be able to ask real or not real, that is such a mercy.
It's also really helped me when friends have written down things they believe to be true about me and given them to me. Because especially if you're going to spend time by yourself, having concrete things that you can look at and be like, this is the truth about how you feel about me, has made a big difference.
Thanks so much. Helen, over to you to ask a question.
Brilliant. So this is a question for Philippa. From Simon Thomas, who says, what has your experience been of forgiving people and situations or God that may have exacerbated or led to depression?
This is a really good question. So I would say there's I can give an example of a specific situation where I needed to forgive. And a real turning point for that was similar to what I was describing with Rwanda, where I had been really hurt by a Christian. And I was also really angry at God because I could see that God was continuing to be nice to that Christian. And I was like, why are you being nice to them? And God showed me, like, basically challenged me with being like, do you believe the cross is effective? Like, do you believe that at the cross, sins were punished and dealt with? And if you do, then you're going to believe that my heart towards this person is going to be to bless them, just in the same way that it is towards you. And that's always been a really powerful thing to me, to think, when people have done me wrong, sometimes I feel like, God, why don't you care? Like, why don't you, especially when it comes from within the church, why are you indifferent to the fact that this person has behaved badly? And yet the cross shows us that God is not indifferent to pain. He doesn't shrug his shoulders and say it's okay that you've treated a person badly. Like, there is a price that needs to be paid if people mess up. But the wonder is that Jesus paid it instead. So that really helped me in the kind of one-time thing. I think I frequently struggle with forgiving people in life. Like, I think it's an ongoing attitude that I have, where I have to be like, the path of discipleship is one of generosity and being generous spirited towards people and not being annoyed with people. I mean, like, God bless my friends, because they know that when I'm depressed, whatever they do is the wrong thing. Whatever they do, I'm annoyed that they've done that and they said that and they've suggested that, and like, whatever it is. And it's actually part of how I identify that I'm getting depressed, is because I'm getting my shotgun out and shooting down every kindness that they send my way out of the sky, because I just don't think it's good enough or comforting enough. And I guess that's the challenge of having to go back to God and say, well, you are going to be my source of generosity and my source of love. And I guess with some people, you need to bring it up and there needs to be, you know, some kind of reconciliation. But I think knowing that God is not indifferent to my pain has been really, really transformative for me as I've struggled.
Thank you, Philippa, so much. We've just got about 5 or so minutes left, so we'll keep going with questions. We've got some great series of questions by Ash Cunningham, where he associates with friends. I've just given him good advice, like play more rugby, eat more tangerines, wear brighter clothes. But the one I want to answer is this one. He says, this just added stones to my little knapsack of anxiety. What do you guys think separates Christianity from the billions of blog pages saying, have you tried this? So, Mark or Kate, do you want to go first on that one?
Go on, Mark, kick us off.
Thanks, Ash. I think that's absolutely fair. And on the face of it, they look, I mean, you can't tell them apart, of course. And, you know, if somebody is sort of searching online between all the different options in the marketplace, if you like, then of course they're all going to feel pretty similar. I think a lot of it is to do with truth claims, what is actually being claimed, and what the credentials for believing those claims might be. So that if you have a worldview that is true, it's got to have been tried and tested in the real world. And so you want, therefore, to be able to see, are there testimonies of people who have been at the end of the tether, have been in the most extreme of circumstances, and yet still held on to these things. And the extraordinary thing is that over 2 millennia, and before Christ, you had people before that, trusting in God. You have people who are saying, okay, look, everything looks terrible. It's bleak, it's dark. In fact, on the surface of things, it's game over. It's all over. And still said, but Lord, I'm going to trust you. And it's paid off in the long run. It's been proven the wise and sensible thing to do, even if in the heat of the moment, or the act of trust, if you like, one's feelings and perceptions and everything are saying you're being an idiot. So does it have that kind of track record? And I think particularly with mental illness, I think it's really interesting, because what you find is throughout Christian history, not only is mental illness not new, but actually it is something that Christians for the last 2,000 years and believers in the Jewish God before that have been able to say, I was in the pit and I put my trust in you and it was still the right thing to do and it came out all right. Tried and tested and not found wanting. And yet the thing is, because of in our culture, in our generation, our age, we're so obsessed with the faddy and the new and the novel. And, you know, the internet is just replete with this stuff. There's always a new scheme or program to sign up to. They just don't have the sticking power and the track records. So actually, being ancient really helps here. And that people have been able to look the darkness right in the face and still persevered. Unlike people who just, you know, gone to sort of, I don't know, I'm not going to even try and think of some silly suggestion because someone will be offended, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I guess I love what you just said, Mark. Absolutely. It's the opposite of the quick fix, isn't it?
Right.
Our faith and our understanding in God gives us that wider perspective and context, and whether that's on our own bodies and brains and why we experience what we do. And why, for example, in lockdown, why is it so cripplingly devastating when we lose the reality of human connection? Why doesn't Zoom work? It doesn't work because we're designed to need connection with other human beings, and Zoom doesn't cut it. And our faith and the Bible gives us a context to help us understand that, which as a psychologist, I think is absolutely wonderful, that ancient wisdom. But also it is an external perspective to our world, our situation, to a world that is chaotic and difficult and dark and things are hard. You know, my son said to me today, why is coronavirus here, Mummy? Why is it here? Those big questions, you can't answer that with psychology. You need a bigger context and something to look to. You know, I love Psalm 18:28 says that God lights up our darkness. And that ancient Hebrew word, it's the same word that they use for how the sun lights up the moon. And I love that. This isn't about us finding some kind of inner cleverness that we solve our own problems because we're just that clever. And if you just meditate on something, you can make all this go away, or do this, eat the tangerines, play the rugby. There's some good advice there. Seek joy. There's good human advice. But ultimately what we need is an external source, something bigger, better, more hopeful, more light-filled than ourselves that we turn to. And that's what we find in our faith.
And I think, like, just to add to what you're saying, like, Christianity doesn't render tangerines irrelevant. That's like the soundbite that you're looking for. All I mean to say is that, like when you have this Christian worldview, then these other things which I have dismissed, like I've kicked suggestions out the window several times, as you can imagine. I'm coming across as a really violent person, I've realized. Never mind. Suggestions have been made, but like, God gave us tangerines, like God gave us rugby to play, God gave us colors, God gave us nature, like all of these things that are often suggested as things that you do. I think that what Christianity does is said to you, a tangerine is not like the solution, but it is actually going to tell you something about the solution. It's going to tell you something about Jesus, who made tangerines, you know, who made a world that has tangerines and oranges and fruit. I hope I've not completely lost people on this, but all I'm saying is, like, the richness of the world, if you're buying into the Christian worldview, you don't discard that. Suddenly it's given greater meaning, and those things can be seen as a gift from God. It's just that Christianity isn't kind of wraps that up within its worldview with a creator, a loving creator at the center. So a tangerine is not just a tangerine, it's a way of God communicating love to you.
Well, Philippa, Kate, Mark, honestly, we are so incredibly grateful to you. The comments coming in are so warm and friendly. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you for your wisdom, your honesty, and your expertise. It's been really wonderful to have so many questions answered. If you felt the question wasn't answered and you'd like an answer, then send it in to the Community in a Crisis Facebook page or the Passion for Evangelism Facebook page. But we want to say a really big thank you to each of our panel, and a really big thank you to Helen for helping me out. We want you to look at the different websites and blogs that each of our panelists represents So Kate's website is mindandsoulfoundation.org. There's some amazing resources on there. I've read loads in recent weeks. They're really relevant, really helpful from a Christian perspective. Then we've got Philippa's blog, acertainbrightness.blogspot.com. Absolutely brilliant. There's always new content that's really helpful and points you back to Jesus. Mark is the author of many books, but certainly When Darkness is My Closest Friend. I think that's the correct title. Is that right, Mark?
Pretty much.
Thank you. So we highly recommend you buy that book as well. But thanks so much from myself and from Helen. We're very grateful for your questions and for your company tonight. See you again at some point soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.